Today I'm going to show you how to draw this detailed mandala from scratch. We'll go step by step, so if you're a complete beginner, that's totally okay. This video is meant for you. Then once we're done drawing the mandala, I'll show you how I colored it in using alcohol markers and fine liner pens. Hi, I'm Tania, and I've been creating mandalas for over 20 years. They mainly started out as elaborate doodles in my sketchbooks, including this super tiny sketchbook. I've also painted some small mandalas with acrylics, like these, that are 6 inches square. Over the past few years, I've mostly enjoyed creating mandalas on paper using gel pens and paint pens. Here are 2 more that I created using metallic markers on dark paper. I also like to create intricate artworks like this, where the whole paper is filled with a bunch of tiny mandalas. Painting mandalas onto rocks and wood is also another artistic passion of mine. Over the past 10 years, I've also created several coloring books that feature mandalas. As you've seen from all these examples, my style is really bright and colorful and full of detail, so that's the style that I'll be demonstrating today. There are many different ways to make mandalas. Mandalas are typically symmetrical, or they spiral, or feature designs that rotate around the central axis. Either way, repetition is an important feature of mandalas. The term mandala comes from Sanskrit, and it means circle. Traditionally, mandalas referred to circular geometric artworks in Hinduism, Buddhism, and other Eastern religions that were used for meditation practice and other spiritual purposes. A great example are Tibetan Thangka paintings, which often take the form of intricate mandalas like these. They're so detailed it can take an artist months of dedicated work just to make a single painting. These days, the term mandala has evolved so that now it's commonly used to describe any circular artwork where repeating designs radiate from a central point. So for example, this Polish paper cutting can be called a mandala, as well as these Costa Rican Oxcart wheels. Both of these are circular designs with repeating elements that emanate from a central point. These days, making mandalas has become a very mainstream art practice around the world. There's something really soothing about the circular format. Our brains are wired to seek patterns, and we enjoy repetition. People often describe that they enter a state of flow as they draw, paint, or color their own mandalas. In the state of flow, your mind becomes so focused on what you're doing that any unnecessary thoughts drift away, and you feel so relaxed that time just flies by. For this reason, many people make mandalas as part of a mindfulness practice or a spiritual practice. The cool thing about mandalas is that they start out really simple, and you gradually add more and more details, so anyone can learn to create stunning mandalas without any previous experience. To follow along with me, here's a list of everything you'll need: paper, pencil, eraser, compass, protractor, ruler, and coloring supplies of your choice. The paper I'll be using is cardstock. I like cardstock because it's inexpensive and it can handle a variety of media, such as colored pencils, markers, gel pens, and paint pens. To create the guidelines a mandala sketch, I recommend using a light pencil, like 2H or harder. This makes it much easier to erase the pencil marks afterwards. The eraser I'll be using is this kneadable eraser. I like that you can use the whole eraser to remove large areas, or you can shape it into a point to erase smaller areas. I got this compass and protractor together in a set from Target for less than $5. You can find them in the stationery section or school supply section. These tools will help make it so much easier to draw our circular guidelines. While it is possible to draw your circular guidelines by hand without these tools, using a compass and protractor makes it so much easier. The ruler I'm using is this wooden ruler from Target, which was only 55 cents. After we sketch in our mandala, we'll color it in. You can use any coloring supplies that you want. I'm going to color in the mandala using these Copic sketch markers, Staedtler Tri-Plus fine liners, and a white Posca paint pen. Feel free to follow along with whatever materials you have on hand. Now that we've got our art supplies, let's get started. The first step in drawing a mandala is to create your guidelines, which will help you create symmetry in your mandala. These circular guidelines are also known as polar graphs, like you see here. If that sounds too mathematical for you, don't worry, it's really not. It's really easy. To create the polar graph, I'm going to use a 2H pencil and press very lightly so that it's easy to erase afterwards. At various points throughout the process, I'll apply this digital overlay on top of my sketch because my pencil marks might be too light to show up well on camera. Let's begin! We're going to start by finding the center of the paper. You can just eyeball it if you want to, and that's totally fine. But for this lesson, I'll go ahead and use a ruler to find the exact center. First, we'll divide the paper in half horizontally, and then we'll divide it in half vertically. Where the two lines intersect will be the exact center. This piece of paper is 8 inches by 8 inches. 8 divided by 2 is 4, so I'll measure down 4 inches from the top. I'll make 2 little dots, line up my ruler underneath them, and then draw a line that connects them, going all the way to the edges of the paper. Now we'll divide the paper in half vertically. I'm placing the ruler on the left edge of the paper, then making a small dot 4 inches in. I'll do this twice and then line up the 2 dots with my ruler, and then draw a line that connects them and goes all the way to the edges of the paper. Now don't worry about making this perfect. We're not aiming for perfection here. It's totally okay if your lines are a little off-center or a little wobbly. Now we're going to take the compass and press the pointy tip right into the center of the paper. I like to wiggle it a little to make sure it's leaving a good indentation, because this will make it easier to draw the circles with the compass. The compass that I'm using has these little measurements, so I can measure out the exact size of the circle that I want to create. Some compasses don't have this feature, and that's totally okay. It's perfectly fine to just eyeball it and create whatever size circles that you want. I'm going to start with my smallest circle, which will be 1 inch across. So to make it 1 inch, I set the compass to ½ inch. Then I stick the little point into the center of the paper. Next, I put the tip of the pencil on the paper, and while holding the pointy arm of the compass, I rotate my paper, creating a 1 inch circle. You can also draw your circle by rotating the compass instead of the paper, but I often find it quicker and easier to just rotate my paper. Now I'm going to make a bigger circle. I set my compass to 1½ inches. I put the pointy end in the center and then rotate my paper. Let's make another circle. I set my compass to 2½ inches, put the pointy end in the center, and rotate my paper. I'm going to make one more circle. I set my compass to 3½ inches, put the pointy part in the center, and then rotate my paper. You can make as many circles as you want with your compass, and you can make them any size that you want. You don't have to follow what I'm doing exactly. This is just to give you an idea of the process, so you can feel free to take it and run with it and do your own thing. So you can see that our polar graph is now divided into 4 quadrants. I want to subdivide these quadrants even more because that will make it easier to create more accurate repetition and symmetry in this mandala. So I'll add a few more dividing lines going diagonally across the paper. For this, I'll use a protractor. I place my protractor so that this little circle is right on top of the center of my paper. I also line up this line on the protractor so that it's directly on top of our horizontal line that we drew. Then I check that the top of the protractor, where it says 90, is lined up with our vertical line. I use one hand to firmly press down on the protractor to make sure it doesn't move. Then I use my pencil to mark out 45 degrees here on the left side and 135 degrees here on the right side. Now I put my pencil on that first dot I made, and then place my ruler so that it lines up that dot with the center of the paper. Then I draw a line that goes all the way through the center and across to the other side. Then I go ahead and do the same thing for the second dot that I made. Now our polar graph is divided into 8 sections. You can definitely stop here if you want and call this part done, but I'll go ahead and divide each section one more time. So I line up my protractor like I did before, and this time I make a dot at 22½ because that's halfway between 0 and 45. For the next section, I make a mark at 67.5. Then I carry on to the other side and make a mark at 112.5. And then make my last mark at 157.5. Then I align each dot with the center of the paper and draw a line going straight through to the other side of the circle. And don't worry if any of your lines are a bit off-center, because by the time we're done, you won't even notice. In fact, I'll go ahead and make this last line just a bit off-center, just to show you that perfection is not at all important here. This project is all about enjoying the process of making a mandala, so we don't really care about perfection. We just want to have fun and go with the flow. Now, I did say that this lesson doesn't require any math skills, but just in case you're wondering where I came up with these numbers, basically, a circle is 360 degrees. When you divide it in half, each half is 180 degrees. When you divide it in half the other way, each quadrant is 90 degrees. When you divide everything in half again, each section is now 45 degrees. Finally, when you divide each section in half one more time, now each section is 22.5 degrees. So now we're done with our polar graph. We're ready to move on to the really fun part where we draw our mandala. Before we start sketching, let me show you some examples of common shapes that are frequently used in mandalas. Humps, pointy humps, petals, and circles. After you draw these basic shapes, you can add more shapes inside of them, on top of them, and around them to create more detailed patterns, and then color them in. There are of course other shapes you can use in your mandalas. These are just a few to give you an idea. Here's an example of how this first pattern might look when repeated around a circle. Now that you're familiar with some of the basic shapes that you can incorporate into your mandala, let's start sketching. I'm going to sketch my mandala design with a pencil. That way, I can correct any mistakes before I color it in. But if you want, you can skip the pencil and go ahead and draw your design with a pen or a colored pencil, for example. It's totally up to you. So I'm going to start in the center. I'll draw a little circle, and then I'll draw little petal shapes coming out of the circle. With these guidelines, it's so easy to make the petals all the same size and shape. As I did with the polar graph, every so often I'll show a darker overlay of our sketch so that you can see it better. Now I'll add some small circles right at the tips of those petals. You really have a lot of freedom here to create any kinds of shapes and designs that you want. Now I'll draw little ovals in between those circles. Now I'll draw some larger petal shapes. As you draw, do feel free to rotate your paper as much as you need to, so that your hand is in the right position to comfortably draw each shape. Next, I'll outline those petal shapes, going all the way to our guideline. Now I'll add some circles in these little crevices. In between them, I'll add these pointy petal shapes. These shapes I just added are kind of small, so for contrast, now I'll add some larger circles. I'll try to make each circle the same size, but it's inevitable that some will be a bit smaller or larger than the others, and that's totally okay. I'm using these straight lines as a guide for centers of the circles, so it's like these straight lines are bisecting the circles. Now I'll add little circles inside those bigger circles. I'm really just making it all up as I go along. You have a lot of freedom when you design your own mandalas, so you can play around with different shapes of different sizes and see what you come up with. Now I'll draw a much bigger shape to create more of a sense of variety in these overall shape sizes. I'm drawing a shape that's pointy towards the center and more rounded on the outside, kind of like a raindrop shape or a petal shape. And remember, don't worry about making these shapes look perfect. It doesn't matter if they don't look identical to one another. Little inconsistencies actually help make your mandala look more personal and handmade, which can lend them a sense of warmth and character. Inside those shapes I just drew, I'll draw similar shapes, so it looks like the bigger shape is outlining the smaller shape. Outlining shapes is a common technique when drawing mandalas. So when in doubt, if you're not sure what to add to your mandala, look for ways that you can outline your existing shapes. Or look for places where you can add smaller shapes inside your larger shapes. Now it's time to fill in the rest of the empty space. I think I'll draw petal shapes again. But this time, I'll draw them in the opposite direction, with the pointy sides facing outwards and the rounded sides facing towards the center. I'm keeping these shapes contained within the two circular guidelines. And now inside these shapes, I'll add a circle. It's pretty cool to see how this is turning out. I need to fill in the spaces between these outermost shapes, so I'll draw some long, curvy petal shapes that go in between them. At this stage, these shapes will definitely not look identical to one another because the exact size and placement of each of these shapes depends on what's around it. And because this is all hand-drawn, there will be little idiosyncrasies like this. But that's totally okay because it gives our mandala a more organic feel. Now we just have one more empty area to fill in. For something different, I'm going to draw little looping lines that go from the tips of these pointy shapes, then form a loop, and then connect to these circles. It can be a bit tricky to get the loops in just the right position, so you'll see me going over it 2 or 3 or even 4 times with my pencil. Because I'm using a hard 2H pencil and I'm pressing really lightly, it's okay for me to go over my lines multiple times because I'll still be able to erase it later. Okay, now for one last finishing touch. I'll add little circles to the tips of these pointy shapes. At this stage, you can look over your sketch and fix anything that you feel looks out of place, like I'm doing here. Now we're done with our mandala sketch. We're ready for the next step, adding color. For this mandala, I'm going to use Staedtler Tri-Plus fine liners to ink over my pencil lines. Remember that you can use any medium that you want to color yours in. I'm starting in the center and working my way outwards, because that feels the most natural to me when creating mandalas. I start by creating a simple outline of the shape on top of the pencil lines, and then I go back in with the pen and add more weight to certain parts of the shapes. This makes the overall line quality much more interesting than if all the lines were simply the same weight. It adds a sense of variation and visual interest. For these circles and ovals, I also want them to connect, so their edges are touching each other, so making the sides wider allows me to achieve this. Because this is a repeating pattern, I'll save some time in this video by not showing every single stroke that I make because you'll get the idea quickly. Now I'm using a different color pen to add some color inside these circles and ovals. As I ink in this mandala, I changed my pen color for the different shapes because I want it to be really colorful. If you wanted, you could just use one color to ink in your mandala, or you could use black. After outlining and thickening these pink petal shapes, I go back in and add a thinner line inside each petal. As you ink in your mandala, you can continue to add more details like this if you feel like it. In my opinion, mandalas look best when they're really detailed, so don't be afraid to go for it. Now I'm thickening up this magenta line, just because I think it'll look better if it's thicker. This is when having pens or markers of different nib sizes can come in handy, because then, instead of manually thickening the line like this, which can be time-consuming, I could just use a marker or pen that has a bigger nib that can create a wider line with just one application, instead of going over it again like this. To ink in this mandala, I've limited myself to 8 colors. I'm mostly using the 6 warm colors, and I'm alternating them as I go along. I want my mandala to have a mostly warm and bright color palette, so I'm using a few different oranges and pinks. Some of these colors are neon, and I'm not sure how well the camera will pick up the color, but hopefully you can see how bright and vivid it is. Inking in these circles is pretty challenging, because it's hard to make perfect circles without using a stencil or tracing a coin or something. But as I've said a few times already, we are definitely not aiming for perfection here. We just want to have fun. Since inking in these circles is pretty tricky, I'm thickening the circles, because that makes it easier to make the circles look more round. Some of these circles look better than others, but overall, if any of them look wonky, it's totally okay. By the time we're done, these wonky shapes won't even be noticeable. Now I'm drawing little circles inside those bigger circles. Let's move on to these big petal shapes. I'll be rotating my paper a lot as I trace over these pencil lines, because when it comes to drawing smooth curved lines like the ones in these petal shapes, it's much easier when you put your arm, hand, and wrist in the right position so that drawing the curve feels natural. If you're struggling to draw curved lines that look the way you want them to, it could be that your hand and wrist are in an awkward position, so just try rotating your paper until it feels more natural and the curves come out more smoothly. For these petals, I'm thickening the lines along the curved edges and leaving the lines thin on the pointy sides. This is just a personal choice to create more variation in the line widths. Thickening the lines can also help hide any mistakes by going over any areas that were wobbly or crooked the first time I drew them. Now I'm tracing over the smaller petals that are inside the larger petals, doing the same thing with the line weights, adding extra lines to make the outer curved side look thicker, which makes the inner pointy side look thinner. Again, I'm rotating my paper as much as I need to, and then moving on to the next set of outer petals that face in the opposite directions of the ones I just did. For these shapes, I'll continue to make the pointy side thinner and the curved side thicker. Now I'm switching to my blue pen and tracing over these long, skinny petal shapes. I also make these shapes thicker at the curved ends and thinner at the pointy ends, rotating the paper as I go. We're almost done with the tracing now. It's time to trace over these looping lines. It can be kind of tricky to get these looping lines to all look the same, so adding extra line weight is one way to help make them look more similar to one another. It would be impossible to make them all look identical, so I'm not worried about that at all. As you know by now, making mandalas is not about perfection. It's about self-expression and creativity, as well as self-acceptance and letting yourself go with the flow. Almost done now! Just tracing over these last few shapes, the circles inside the petals. And the small circles at the very tips of these pointy shapes. Now we're done tracing! It already looks pretty cool, but when we add even more color, it's really gonna come to life. First though, before you start coloring, it's a good idea to erase your pencil lines so they won't be visible in your final artwork. If you color over pencil lines with markers, the pencil lines will usually show through, especially if you're using light-colored markers. For this artwork, I don't want the pencil lines to show through, so I'm using my kneaded eraser and carefully erasing as much of the pencil lines as I can. I hold the paper down firmly with my left hand and press gently and carefully with the eraser in my right hand. I try not to rub the paper too hard with the eraser because I don't want the paper to crinkle. It's pretty easy for me to erase these pencil lines since I drew them in so lightly using a hard 2H pencil. Now we're ready to color this in with markers. I'm using Copic sketch markers to color this in. Copic markers are alcohol-based, and I really enjoy using them because of their vibrant range of colors and awesome blending ability. I'm using 21 different marker colors from 5 different Copic color families: yellow, yellow-red, violet, red-violet, and blue. You can see most of them on the right. I chose these marker colors to complement the pen colors that I used to trace over the line art. Since the focus of this video is about how to draw a mandala, I won't go into too much detail about specific alcohol marker techniques. If you're interested in using alcohol markers, I have several other videos on my channel that demonstrate how to use them, so be sure to check those out. But here, you can still see how I'm blending them. For these blue petals, for example, I'm blending from dark to light, so that it's lighter along the outer edges of these petals and darker towards the center. Blending markers to create gradients or ombres like this really helps make an artwork look more dynamic. Alcohol markers blend best while the ink is still damp, so I have to work quickly because I want the blends to look nice and smooth. This tutorial is already rather long, so I won't show the entire process here because that would make this video even longer. So for each repeating shape, I'll demonstrate the coloring process at least once or twice before jumping ahead to the next shape, so you can still get a very good idea of what I'm doing. Now I'll use a darker blue to color the area around the petals, but I won't do any blending for this section. I'm using the brush tips of these Copic sketch markers, which are perfect for getting into really tight spaces, like these tight corners in between the petals. If you want to learn alcohol marker techniques more in depth, check out my ultimate guide to using alcohol markers. I'll post a link to it below this video. It's perfect for beginners because I start with the very basics and demonstrate several different blending techniques and explain blending theory. Printable line art is included along with 3 step-by-step coloring projects, so you can really build your skills and gain confidence with using alcohol markers. For these areas, I'll blend a yellow-orange color to yellow to light yellow and then blend it into the white of the paper, so it looks like the color gradually fades out. Blending from a color to white is one of my favorite alcohol marker blending techniques for creating vibrant, luminescent blends. If you're enjoying this mandala tutorial and you find it useful, please tap the like button. That helps me know that you enjoy this kind of content, and it encourages me to make more videos like this for you. It also helps the YouTube algorithm show this video to more people, so it's a super easy way that you can help support my channel, and I really appreciate it. Now we're moving on to the outer shapes of this mandala, where I'm continuing to blend my alcohol markers to help give these shapes a sense of dimension by making them darker at their tops and bottoms and lighter towards their centers. Now for these long blue petal shapes. I'm making them darker at their pointy tips and lighter along their rounded edges. You'll notice that I work on a few at a time instead of doing them all at once. This is just to help make sure that the ink stays damp, which makes it easier to blend. If I work on too many areas at once, the ink could start to dry out for the first shapes that I did, so by the time I get back to them, they might not blend as well if they're too dry. So that's why I work on a few shapes at a time. For these outer petals, I've decided to split the colors and create a pale peachy orange blend on the left side of the shape and pink blend on the right side of the shape. I'm making the petals more saturated with color at the tops and bottoms and fade to white near their centers. Because alcohol markers blend so well, it's easy to make a natural looking transition from the peachy orange side to the pink side. I'm really happy with how this is turning out. Now I'm adding a pale pink color along these edges and fading them out to the white of the paper. I'm working on 2 sections at a time and rotating my paper as I go along. We're almost done with the alcohol marker portion of this coloring. I'm just using the peachy orange colors on these small loopy petal shapes and blending them to white. So here's how it looks now that I've colored it in with alcohol markers. You could certainly stop here if you wanted to and call it done, but I'm going to keep going and add more details. I'm using the Staedtler Triplus fineliners again to add subtle details here and there. I'm adding things like lines and dots. And also, I'm outlining some of the shapes to help them stand out more. Like here, I'm using a blue pen to outline these pink petals and help them pop more. Some of these details are really subtle, but they're a bit easier to see in real life. Now I'm using my neon pink Staedtler Triplus fineliner to add some extra designs around these circles. And then I use a magenta fineliner to outline the inner circles to help separate them from the neon pink designs I just added. Time to add more dots. For these blue dots, I'm varying the sizes of the dots so they go from bigger to smaller. Adding dots to an abstract artwork is a fun way to make it look more whimsical. In fact, let's add even more dots, with pink this time. If If you're enjoying this mandala tutorial and want to see more of my art videos, subscribe to my channel so that you never miss a thing. We're almost done. I decided to add yellow circles inside these big petals because it was looking a bit empty there. And then I add more yellow circles around the outside. To help these circles stand out more, I outline them with a neon orange fine liner pen. And now for the finishing touches. I'm using a white Posca paint pen to add some final details, like dots and little lines. You could also use a white gel pen for this. One last detail and then I'm done. I'm just using a fine liner pen again to add these tiny petal shapes to help fill in these spaces. And now we're done! Here's our finished mandala! Yay! I hope you enjoyed this mandala tutorial and found it useful. Let me know in the comments. If you create a mandala based on this lesson, I would love to see how it turns out. Feel free to post it on social media and tag me so that I can be sure to see it. And if you replicate my design exactly, then please give me credit in your posts. If you liked this video, you might also enjoy this other video where I show you how I colored in this luminescent mandala. See you next time!